everyone. I hope you've taken your seats, and welcome to this first keynote and panel discussion on the global feminist economy. I'm going to start by introducing myself, and then I'll follow by introducing our wonderful three panelists today. My name is Gail Rago, as Rebecca just introduced, and I'm a social justice activist who's been present in the Brussels European social activist space for a while now, mostly in child rights, digital rights, gender, and climate justice. I like to call myself a Jill of all trades. I do a lot of different things, one of which is obviously being a moderator, but I'm also a communication consultant, I'm a podcast host, and that's actually how Rebecca heard of me, which is, I think, very good praise. I'm also a career coach and a trainer. And yeah, that's enough about me. I'm going to now introduce our three wonderful guests, starting by Jayati Ghosh, who is joining us here virtually. And we're going to hope that the technical gods will be with us today and we will not have any issues. And then we have Carola, Rackete, and Jean Saldanha from Eurodad. So Jayati Ghosh is a renowned economist and professor. She's internationally acclaimed for her expertise in development economics, global inequality, and labor rights. She's currently a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and has authored and edited 20 books and over 200 scholarly articles focusing on critical issues like the global financial system, food security, and climate change. Next, we have Carola Rackete, sitting right next to me, who is an ecologist and advocate for climate justice. She gained international recognition as the captain of Sea-Watch 3. She was elected to the European Parliament in 2024 and serves on key committees, including the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, and the Committee on Agriculture, where she continues her work to promote sustainability, climate, and social justice. The main focus of her work with the parliamentary system is to strengthen environmental justice movements. And last but not least, we have Jean Saldanha, who is a director at Eurodad, which is the European Network on Debt and Development. Previously, she worked as a senior advisor at SIDSE, the International Alliance of Catholic Development Organizations, and she led the European and international civil society coalition's efforts on the UN's financing for development and post-2015 SDG processes. Jean, who hails from Mumbai, was also active in the human rights movement in India as a law student. So welcome to our three wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we get to the panel discussion, the way this panel will kind of flow is we'll have first a short keynote from Jayati, followed by a panel discussion where I will be asking our panelists some questions, and then we'll open to the floor so that you can also ask our speakers any questions you may have, so keep them in mind. I really hope that you'll find this a very interesting and engaging discussion.
Thank you all for allowing me to join you even virtually. I'm sorry to have created all these hiccups with the sound and everything else, but I'm looking forward to being able to hear the rest of the discussion as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of a feminist perspective in a left movement. And I think this is important, and because of the audience, right? I mean, I think I'm speaking to like-minded people out here. I think I'm speaking to people who understand what it means to be in the left movement and an anti-colonial movement. And I want to talk about why a feminist perspective is so important in this. I believe Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and pretty much all of you, I'm sure, are broadly in line with an internationalist view of the world, which recognizes the importance of imperialism. Yeah? And for me, imperialism is the struggle of large capital to control economic territory when it is assisted by states. So we know that imperialism is not dead. It certainly didn't die with the end of political colonization or the phase of decolonization. And it hasn't died today in very, very explicit and overt ways. So the territory that is sought to be controlled is very complex and wide, and its scope is constantly expanding. The territory obviously includes things like land and nature, and we know that. And that was what traditionally imperialism was all about, controlling land, especially the parts of land that are very rich with natural resources and oil and minerals and so on. But it also includes controlling markets of different kinds, It includes controlling labor in different kinds and in different places. But it also includes all kinds of new economic territory. So, for example, a whole range of property that had just very recently been created, like intellectual property, which really, for the first half of my life, was really not seen as that knowledge is something that you can split up into units and commercialize, privatize, and monopolize. Yet we now know that that is a very major part of the control of economic territory. A whole range of essential utilities and amenities that were earlier seen as part of public provision and automatic and a right of every citizen, like water or basic needs of that kind, electricity and so on, are now also privatized, and there is also increasingly seen as new economic territory. I don't know whether here in your room you have bottled water, but in every conference or seminar I attend in the US, there is bottled water in those little plastic bottles. It's a form of privatization which is creating economic territory that didn't exist earlier. And we now have also control over cyberspace. In other words, the kinds of economic territory that are now recognized and are fought over by large capital with the assistance of states are continuously expanding. And that expansion means it reflects two things. One is, of course, the constant ability of capital to reinvent itself. But the other is the fact that it needs to do that because the traditional markets are all either saturated or dying, that the growing inequality has meant massive underconsumption and an inability to generate expansion simply because of the major inequalities that have grown as a result. Now, all of this I think you probably all know, and this is probably the frame in which you're looking at a lot of international relations today. To me, one of the major things that has been missing in this perspective is the critical insight provided by feminist economics, particularly the issue of unpaid labor. And it is something that only recently got to be recognized, let's admit it, even by radical scholars, by thinkers from the left. It is essentially a recognition of the fact that the economy rests on a combination of different kinds of labor, which extend from extremely well paid and highly professional, and which are really close to capital in the sense that the highest paid workers on earth are probably the bankers of New York City, who get not just salaries but also shares in the firms that they are participating in and so on, down the entire range of lower and lower and lower paid labor to the unpaid labor. And that spectrum, the significance of unpaid labor, is something that has been typically left out. So radical economists have tended to focus on all the different types of paid labor. But we have not given, at least in the past, we did not give sufficient attention to the issue of unpaid labor. And that's absolutely critical because it affects all other parts of the ways in which markets are generated and commercial activity is created. So one thing we know is that there's a very strong gender division of labor and unpaid labor. So this is why perhaps it's really, as I said, feminist economists who focused on it, but I do believe it's the major contribution. And that gender dimension stems from an essential biological fact, which is that women have been the ones giving birth to children. But it extends way beyond that. In other words, the biological activity of giving birth requires 9 months of pregnancy and maybe at most another year of continuous involvement with the child. But it does not involve the entire range of activities that are then seen as part of women's work, which is the care of others in the household, the direct and indirect care. So not only are you looking after the young, the old, the less physically able, and so on and so forth, but you're also doing the cooking, cleaning, fetching, carrying, provisioning for the household, none of which requires biology. But it has been made in pretty much all societies into this gendered division of labor. Now, the critical thing about this, of course, is that within families and it also often within communities, it is unpaid work. And it is often not even recognized as such. It is not really seen at least in capitalist market framework, as productive activity. And many of the women who do this are not even classified as being in the labor force. In India, for example, the statistics identifies them as being engaged in household duties, which are not seen as part of the productive economy. But in fact, this unpaid workforce is the critical substratum on which the entire economy depends, and it actually subsidizes the rest of the recognized or formal market economy. And because of this existence of unpaid labor, a number of other issues arise with respect to the the segmentation of the labor market and occupational segregation, which is that, first of all, when women do enter paid workforce, they're typically entering first or most into those activities that are associated with the unpaid work that they do at home, in care activities of different kinds, at different levels of pay and so on, or in very low paid activities. So it already assumes that you're going to, if you can work for free, then your reservation wage is obviously very low. And so typically the more unpaid work is performed by women in any society, the larger the gender wage gaps. And of course, once you get the occupational segregation, then anyone who does that kind of work faces the same wage penalty. So men who do, let's say, looking after children in nurseries or preschool child teaching and pedagogy and so on, are also facing the wage penalty. That's in terms of the labor process. The labor market segmentation extends into other things as well. It extends into race, caste in India, ethnic origin, linguistic migration status, etc., a lot of other things. The other aspect of this is that it then influences the control over assets. So assets are hugely divided not only, of course, by class, which we know, which is really the definitional sort of part of what makes a class, but also within classes by gender. And part of this is related to the need to ensure that all this unpaid work continues. In other words, you see, it's not just that it so happens that it's being done. It's the societies need this work to be done on a regular basis without any problem. And you need a sort of enforcing mechanism to make sure it's done all the time. And therefore, you have to deprive those who are, in a sense, being forced to do it, of other possibilities of not having to do it, to deprive them of potential earning activities or access to assets that would deny them. It also affects the nature of social policies. States and private employers rely on this unpaid work and on the division of labor that is associated with it, which is very culturally defined. They rely on this in terms of being able to cut back on a whole range of social provision, on using business cycles in periods of austerity. Austerity is really another way of forcing more unpaid labor onto households, which really means onto women. And a whole range of other activities. So it is not that public policies are gender blind. Rather, public policies are gender exploitative. They exploit the fact of these gender differences, whether they say so or not. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because, these are typically missing from most of our movements for economic sovereignty or for for working class control or anything. We tend to put this as subordinate to the broader and larger requirements that we have of an economic system. So we don't see these as an integral part of the economic transformation that we want. We see them as coming later, maybe. I mean, this has been true for more than a century, right? Women in the left movement have always been told, wait till the class struggle wins, wait till the proletarian revolution, and then we'll sort out your problems, and so on. But it's something that is still missing, and I want to emphasize this. And it is still missing across the world in many, many progressive movements that I can think of. Now, all of this, obviously, as I said, affects the left movements, but I want to emphasize that once you have a gender perspective, you realize how both economic processes and economic policies cannot be understood, really, without looking at that particular important difference. And it clearly is fiscal policies, for example, directly impact men and women differently, tax policies for sure, but they also have implications in that how you raise the resources and how much you raise impacts your ability to provide public services. And I've already pointed out the gender implications of providing or not providing essential public services and the quality of those services and the ways in which they are provided and all of that. They affect monetary and financial policies. And we already know that the financial world is even more unequally divided. Wealth is even more unequally distributed than income, both across classes and by gender. And that policies that disproportionately favor the wealthy or that disproportionately benefit large capital also therefore have a strong gender dimension. They affect industrial policies, and I want to emphasize this because this is the current fashion again, right? Everybody is now buzzing about industrial policy. It's suddenly come back. The thing that could not be named is now on everybody's lips, and everyone's talking about industrial policy. There are many aspects of industrial policy, some of which reflect on what I was talking about earlier, about imperialism and neocolonialism and all that. But there are aspects of industrial policy which are shockingly gender exploitative as well. And this has really to do with which industries are recognized as the important industries of the future. So whether you're looking at the European Green New Deal, or you're looking at the US IRA, or you're looking at industrial policies in Indonesia or somewhere else, you find that the care activities are simply not even considered an industry. They're not even thought of as an important economic activity of the future that has to be promoted. And yet we know that one of the big problems in most economies today is employment generation. We know that care activities along with the creative sector are possibly the two economic activities that will continue to be hugely reliant on labor, no matter what happens to technology. You will never replace human labor in care or in creative industries with technology. You can support it, but you will not replace it, which is unlike a whole bunch of other activities, let's admit. And yet care is never treated as a major industrial sector to support. And it's not even brought in there as an important variable. We have a lot of studies now about the massive multiplier effects of care work. There's a study by the UK Women's Budget Group that tells us that the multiplier of investment in care is 4, whereas the multiplier for investment in infrastructure is 1.5. So it's a it's a significant difference actually, right? Yet we are in a world in which industrial policies are seen as really part of that so-called formal economy, which will continue to be subsidized and fed into by this huge substratum of unpaid care. And this is also true for a whole range of trade and foreign investment policies and so on. I could go on and on. My real point is this, is that if we have to stop thinking of feminist economics as a different branch of economics. It's not. It is really that it gives you a perspective with which to look at every other aspect of economic life. And the reason we have to do that is because economies persist in relying heavily on this gender inequality, even when they don't talk about it. So essentially, what I want to emphasize is that we need a gender perspective, not only because, we want to be nice to women or we are women or whatever. We need it because we cannot understand a whole bunch of economic processes otherwise. And we certainly cannot understand either how economic policies get formed in particular ways, how they get designed and implemented in particular ways, or what the impact of that will be on people at large. And that means also that the impact it will have not just on men, but also on children and the elderly and everyone else. And so, I don't know if I took 20 minutes, but I hope that's pretty much what I had to say, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I hope I get to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that really useful macro level understanding of what global feminist economics is and why we need to have that framework, not as a side step, but more as looking at that holistically to challenge any kind of issue, policy that we're trying to solve. And with that, hoping that you can continue to hear me, we're going to kick off the panel discussion. And I'm going to start by asking you, Jayati. You mentioned, of course, you talked a lot about the feminist perspective in understanding the economy. So my question to you is, how could a feminist economy address the legacies of economic imperialism and create pathways for the global majority to achieve economic sovereignty without perpetuating patriarchal structures?
Yeah, I think that, I kind of touched on it when I was speaking, but I'm glad to get a chance to elaborate it. Because, far too many of our movements for national sovereignty or even local sovereignty or any kind of anti-colonial are imbued with patriarchy, right? And I don't have to name them, we all know them. And we're all living in them and so on, right? So it's a real dilemma. And the dilemma is not so much that of feminists or women saying, no, you have to consider this. The dilemma is to get those who are leading those movements and all the men who are involved in it to recognize that this has to be an integral part of the struggle. And I wish I knew I had a good answer to that one. I don't know how we do it. I mean, we all have to keep shouting, I suppose, and make ourselves very noisy and unpleasant and so on. But there is a deeper problem, which is that because economics has always been framed for so long as very male, as ultimately a very male domain in which, we're kind of begging to be allowed entry. Women are allowed entry into economic activities. The World Economic Forum says, oh yes, if you bring more women into the workforce, the GDP grows up by so much. In other words, it's always let us into this. We are not saying let us turn this over and make it a different kind of economy. So I think the way all of us have to begin is by really having a complete rethinking of what we want from an economy. We are all essentially worshipping at the god of GDP, whether we like it or not, because that's the way in which it's all framed. Marketed economic activities, the sum total is GDP, and so we have to do whatever is required to make GDP grow. And if women working employed is part of it, then that's very good. But we should not be thinking of the economy that way. And that's the real decolonization. We have to decolonize our minds on how we view the economy. And I'm sorry, last point. We have to think of the economy in terms of how it serves the needs of society and the planet. So we need a society that can achieve, capabilities for all, freedom for all, voice for all, in harmony with nature and the planet. And then think of all the elements of the economy that will get us there. Instead of saying, if we grow the economy, we can then do stuff for society and the planet and etc. So it's a reversal of how we are all thinking about the economy. And because we are in that world, we are doing this unconsciously all the time. It's actually a strong effort to force yourself to think the other way.
Thank you, Jayati. Very useful, again, to kind of put out the fact that because for so long we've blindly had to listen and follow the people who get to make these decisions, which usually are very, as you said, male, very particular, we have lost so much in this obsession with GDP as the only standard for looking at growth. So thank you very much for that. And I will now ask a next question to Carola, linked to climate justice. Climate justice is deeply intertwined with economic justice. How do you think a feminist economy can shape the European Union's approach to global climate justice, especially in relation to its responsibility towards the global majority?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. And just to say that, unfortunately, I'm not an economist. I have way too little knowledge about the feminist economics. I'm very interested to hear from you. And I'm just speaking from, very basics, very practical things, I would say. So it's now just 2 months that I have been in the European Parliament. I'm newly elected. And I have a little question for the room. Do you think, if you know the European institutions really well, please raise your hand. Do you think you know a little bit about European institutions? Okay, yeah. That's what I thought. And I think the European institutions are very complicated because they're basically three: the European Parliament, which I'm a member of, the Council, which is where the different countries are members of, and then the Commission, which is basically the government. And then we have, of course, corporations, which are not part officially, but they do a huge and massive amount of lobbying. And it's absolutely not in the interest of the citizens of any gender whatsoever. And I think that is the point where we would have to say, for me, feminist economics would mean out with the corporations, out with the lobbying, out with the industries. You know, that would be one really important first step to, let's say, I hate this word, but take back control of the institutions and bring real democracy into them. And another point, of course, the European Union has come out of the economic union. And always the European Union has advocated for their own economic interest and continues to do so. It's a completely colonial and now neo-colonial project. And you see that, at least for me, first and foremost, in the policies towards migration. And worse so when we know that more and more people will be forcibly displaced because of migration, and they will just be killed at the European border, as is already the case. And I think this is another massive, absolutely massive issue. And now that we have currently had, just 2 months ago, had the elections, I would like to tell you just a practical example. You of course know that the far right has been gaining a lot more votes, that the majorities in the parliament are not really good. The first sitting where everyone was coming together in Strasbourg, there was the first scandal, and you will not believe about what? About abortion. There was a woman in the plenary from the Liberals, so from Renew, quite in the center, and she was saying that she was wishing for the future that there should be a law which makes abortion legal in all of the European Union countries. And then there was somebody getting up from the far right, a woman actually, with her very religious perspective, and she started screaming and screaming. And she interrupted the plenary for several times. She insisted, and she had to be carried out by the security guards, the first sitting. And I think that is unfortunately the standard where we are at with the parliament. Even that access to abortion is not a given in this European Union. I would have never thought that this could create a scandal. Or even Ursula von der Leyen, I'm not a fan, it's quite clear. But she's trying at least to have gender parity when talking about the commissioners, so these kind of important postings in the European Union. And the countries are completely refusing to name male and female or other gender candidates. There's no gender parity, not even that. So unfortunately, with this newly elected parliament, it's going to be quite difficult. But even more so, we are here. We are here and we have to do our best. I don't want to speak for too long because I think that was more than 3 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Carola. Again, a very important reminder that as we are here in Europe that likes to pretend that everything is very human rights and done in the best way possible, we are seeing through a lot of these global crises and through looking at our own backyards what Europe actually stands for and what are words and what is just rhetoric. And hopefully this means that people who are going to be critical, people who are going to push the right buttons like Carola, will start to change the system. But again, as Jayati had mentioned, trying to fix a broken system is maybe not the best way forward, which is why we continue to struggle with this uphill battle. I'm going to now turn to Jean, someone who probably does know much more about economics than me and Carola perhaps, which is what role do international financial institutions play in perpetuating gender inequality through debt policies, and how could feminist economy reforms, or how could they reform these institutions?
Thanks a lot, Gail. Actually, I'm not an economist either, so don't worry, Carola. We are in good company. I'm actually a human rights lawyer, and it gives me great pleasure to hear Jayati, because I'm also a feminist, and I consider myself an activist, a feminist, and then a human rights lawyer. And it's so fantastic to hear you, Carola. I mean, it gives me so much of hope to know that people like you are representing us in the parliament and really calling out what is really going on, the immense power of corporate lobbies over regulation and the creation of a European policy, not only in Europe, but also externally, and that's the focus of Eurodad. We are a network of organizations working mainly on the impact of finance on the development opportunities of the global south. It's a very, very kind of post-colonial, critical and anti-imperialistic perspective that we take. And indeed, it is going to be an uphill struggle with the new cycle of the institutional formation, with the new parliament and with the new council as well. And so I really wish you all the very best, and looking forward to lots of fun and games. But turning to the international financial institutions, because that is indeed one of the key focus of Eurodad's work. If you ask me what their role is, it is central. It is definitely central in perpetuating gender inequality in the world today. So when we're talking about the international financial institutions, there are two key international financial institutions that were created around 80 years ago. And if you think about 80 years ago, this is the time that was still very much in the middle of colonialism. So think of an 80-year-old international financial architecture with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank right at the center. Now, they continue to hold the monopoly on a whole lot of issues that impact the economic chances of everybody, but particularly of women and gender minorities in the world. I'll give you two or three couple examples. So first of all, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, does what it's called debt sustainability analysis. So basically what it does is it analyzes the extent to which a country can hold the debt, the amount of money it has borrowed, how much it can continue to borrow money, and whether it can continue to pay back that money in a way that keeps the economy afloat. So its main interest is ensuring that economies stay afloat. It's not about the people, not ensuring healthy economies and most of all, healthy societies in healthy economies. Their interest, as Jayati mentioned, is very much on keeping economies afloat, and that starts the problem over there. So what are the metrics they're using? GDP, again. And it has been empirically shown that when the focus of a country, particularly a country which is at medium or high risk of debt distress, as we see many at the moment all over the world, if you look at the papers, essentially, when they are focusing on getting their countries back on track, their economies back on track, it is going to increase the feminization of poverty. There are going to be many more women and gender minorities pushed into poverty. We can go into the why, but that is essentially empirically proven. Unfortunately, this continues to be a key matrix, and this is just an example of how they do it. Another thing that they do is policy advice to countries to ensure that their countries stay afloat. And essentially, what we have seen, despite the fact that there is, again, empirical evidence to prove the contrary, they advise their countries to cut the public wage bill and to impose austerity in various ways. And essentially, this inevitably leads to, again, the biggest impact on women and gender minorities. So that's one aspect, their role in fiscal and economic policy advice and their kind of signaling function on debt. Then, particularly for countries who find it impossible or are not qualified to get emergency lending from other sources. Of course, this is not the Europes of this world, this is not the Japans of this world, because there are other mechanisms, but a large part of the global south does not qualify for that kind of public financial safety net, as it's called. They rely on the IMF as the lender of last resort. When they cannot get money from anywhere else, they have to rely on the IMF. And what happens over there is that before the IMF agrees to kind of give the green light for that money to be given to them, they have to do prior actions. And even after they get that money, they have to do certain things, certain conditions, to be able to be considered to stay on track. Now, this is similar if you have people from Greece over here. I'm sure that you've experienced this in the European context, but this is pretty much the similar kind of textbook that the IMF follows all over the world. And even though it went badly wrong in Greece, and it has gone badly wrong all over the world for many, many years, it continues to do that, and it continues to do that this year. You've seen it in Kenya, where you have had kids on the street protesting against it. You've seen it in Sri Lanka. They continue to do this. And essentially, what it again means is what they do in their kind of usual playbook, which is privatization, liberalization, austerity. And I do not need to kind of explain how this is going to impact poverty, increased levels of poverty, reduced investment in public services, which directly impact girls, women, and gender minorities. So I'll stop over there because I think I've taken my 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. You definitely knew much more about economics than we did, though. Thank you for setting that up and explaining to us how these things work. Again, showing us that the systems that we believe are doing what they should and benefiting us are doing the opposite. And we've relied on them for a long time. And in fact, a lot of countries have no choice but to rely on these institutions. The next question is for all 3 panelists. It's how can we ensure that a feminist economy does not only remain an academic or theoretical framework, but is translated into actionable policies that tackle real-world issues like energy, climate, labor, and housing inequality? Who would like to go first?
Go, Jayati.
I can see you're all looking at me.
That's true. Go ahead, Jayati.
So, here I want to emphasize that a feminist economy is not very far from, let's say, a human rights economy. Yeah? In fact, the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN, he's actually been talking a lot about advocating a human rights economy. And if you look at the elements of it, they're almost identical with what any of us would want. Okay? We have other groups all over the world who are talking about solidarity economies, which are broadly similar. So I think we have to stop putting ourselves in a silo saying, okay, we are this feminist and we do feminist economy. We have to join forces with everybody else who wants the same kind of thing, which is an economy that is less based on unequal power and less based on also relational power. I want to emphasize, okay, so this is a point I wanted to make earlier and I couldn't, or I forgot rather, which is that in economics we're usually concerned about distributional power. Who gets how much of what? And so how much income, how much assets, how much access to education, how much access to health, all of the distribution. We do not pay enough attention to relational power, which is the power of a person or a group to influence the decisions and outcomes of another person or group. And so gender is a classic example of relational power, but it's not the only one. Okay, large capital has that with regard to smaller capital, and certain workers have it with regard to others. Majorities in some countries have it with minorities, local residents with migrants, and so on. So we see relational power all over. We have to confront relational power in how it plays out in the economy, and for that we need to make alliances. So the only way we will practically implement it is not if we just say we're going to be this band of feminists. I think what Carola is doing is wonderful because she's involved in a parliament where she has to engage with others and make alliances. And I think that's really the only way to go, coalitions and alliances.
Thanks, Jayati. Who would like to go next?
Well, I will speak only about the tiny subjects that I know a little bit about, because I see the other panelists are way more experienced in this topic. And I would like to speak about a particular part of care work that I think, for me as an ecologist, but actually for all of us, should be really important. And that is the question of ecological restoration. Because when we talk about care and about reproduction, I think for me as an ecologist, I also see it within my field. We're often talking about the people who are protecting these wonderful, pristine areas, but we're still very little talking about those ecologists who go to places that have been destroyed and try to, at least to help them to get into a better and more healthier state. And I think this is something which to me is care work. It is something that cares about the planet, but also improves greatly the health. For example, within cities, we know that it's very important to have more green spaces, to be able to cycle and all of that. So it's very connected to our well-being. And I think in the question of biodiversity or taking care of our living planet, there's also a lot of, I don't even like to say it this way, but economic opportunity or just real opportunity for us to take care of our responsibilities and make sure that the planet is safe to live for the next generations, actually.
Thanks. Jean.
I know that sometimes we say we need revolution rather than reform, but I still think that there needs to be things done before the revolution comes. And that's what we are focusing on at Eurodad. So, I mean, if you ask what we can do until that revolution comes, it is a lot still. I mean, speaking about an institution that is 80 years old, that was very much designed in a colonial world by colonial powers, I think, first of all, there needs to be a more balanced international financial architecture. We need to ensure that, first of all, the IFIs are no longer judge and jury, because as I explained in the previous kind of answer, the IMF, for instance, it provides policy advice as well as being an arbitrator on lenders, on lending decisions and on debt. But the question is, in whose interest are these? Is this policy advice given, and whether they are really neutral? And the answer is no. Essentially, they still defend the interests of the colonial powers that were at the center of their design. The US still has veto rights. And coming to another issue, which should change and can change, which is what is called SDRs, special drawing rights, IMF money, if you can call it that. Now, every member of the IMF has a right to draw on that money when it needs to. But unfortunately, the share of the SDRs that they can draw is already fixed. That's called their quota shares. And essentially, countries, and ironically again, countries that need it the least, countries like Europe and the US, Europe is not a country, but certainly Germany or France or whatever, countries that need it the least essentially get more of the SDR pie when the IMF decides to issue it than a country that really needs it, cannot get access to finance from anywhere else. And this, in turn, will impact on the implications, what the country can do with that fiscal space that that is created. There was an issuance of SDRs equivalent to 650 billion of US dollars in 2021. Only 1/10 of that reached the global south. The rest went to the countries that needed it the least. And those countries can, again, send it to the IMF in the form of trusts that then go to the global south. But the money from those trusts, again, have IMF conditions attached, which is problematic. So there is a way to change that and to make sure that the IMF issues those SDRs in a needs-based way and reforms the quota. And before it reforms that quota, make sure that it decouples SDR issuance from the amount of SDRs that reach the global south. But the US still has a veto power. And essentially, the US Congress has still refused to reissue the SDRs that it got, which are basically lying unused because the US doesn't need it. I mean, so that just shows how things can potentially change, but they do not. Another example is so-called surcharges, which is another scandal, another scandalous policy of the IMF. Basically, it is a penalty charged on countries when they are late in their payments to the IMF. And it only penalizes countries that are already facing payment difficulties. So it is another way in which the IMF is kind of reproducing these power imbalances and can change and should change. But it requires decisions by the IMF, an IMF which, again, is dominated by the global north and where the borrowing countries that need that kind of finance net the most, do not have enough of voice. So that can change. It should change. There is a lot more to be done, but until then, I do believe that these things can be addressed.
Thanks, Jean. So I'm hearing a lot about power and power imbalances, and I think it's a very important concept to be discussing, to look at who historically has had power, how power is distributed now, and how it creates and continues to perpetuate inequality. So thank you for sharing those examples and thoughts. I'm going to move to asking Jayati a question about intersectionality. And before I do that, I'm actually going to share a story with you, a personal story of mine, to kind of showcase how sometimes we can do so much talk but so little action. A couple of years ago, I was a board member for, I won't name names, because, you know, Brussels bubble, very tiny. But I was a board member for this little, let's say, group that wanted to look at improving diversity on event panels. Very happy that we are a very diverse group today. And when we were talking about how to do this, without going into the details, at some point, the proposal made by the organization was, why don't we first focus on gender diversity, and then we'll focus on the others? And for most of us in the board who were from a lot of diverse, marginalized backgrounds, this was just ludicrous, because we're like, how long, and I think this was something that Jayati talked about as well, how long will we do this pyramid of oppression? First, we'll focus on gender. When is it going to be race this time? What about, migration? What about all these other marginalizations? It's so ridiculous to look at any issue from such a one-dimensional perspective, and ultimately that helps no one, right? So all of that just to say that that was also my personal experience not even that long ago in a kind of activity where all of the talk was about intersectionality, and then to actually see the perspectives were so, well, let's say backward. So there's a long way to go, let's say, even within feminist movements. So with that, I wanted to ask Jayati a question. From an intersectional feminist lens, how does gender, race, and class intersect with the current global economic system to perpetuate disparities?
Well, yeah, huge question. I mean, I guess we have to begin with the with recognizing that intersectional inequalities are very useful for capitalism. It's not an accident that they are perpetuated and even encouraged by different ways in which economic policies and processes operate. Because they enable segmented labor markets, which I've already mentioned, and those segmented labor markets allow you to have different degrees of exploitation. So you can go from the, absolute unpaid work to the very, very terribly paid and very marginal kinds of workers working in very difficult and disgusting conditions, and so on and so forth, all the way up, right? So that's one. But they also serve to divide the working class or anyone who is oppressed. So intersectionality is very useful from the point of view of political control. And so it's a very peculiar thing that relational inequalities are actively exploited to enable a much greater and deeper inequality, which is broadly, and I'm putting it now in the most simplistic possible way, but it's broadly the control of large capital over everybody in the world, except that we don't see it that way. We see it in terms of what is happening around us with the intersectionalities of caste and class and race and gender and etc. And so we're angry with that particular thing. And that enables a broader capitalist system that is allowing a few, essentially large capitalists, to run the world. And we have to rid ourselves of the notion that the world is actually being run by those who call themselves world leaders. It's run by large capital in different ways. And intersectionality is very useful for that. So how do we overcome that? Of course, by recognizing it, yes, but not letting that also become the dominant thing then for us. And so here's the difficulty I find even with a lot of progressive movements in India and other countries that I'm familiar with, that we get very divided by the intersectionality. In India, the women's movement is divided because there are Dalit young women who are saying that, not enough voice is being given there, so we will form our own separate group. And this is encouraged, of course, by those in power, because that is very useful and convenient. The same thing across other castes, same thing, certainly by migrant status, that's a very, very big one. Local workers resenting and resisting the enabling of migrant workers. Somehow we have to try and overcome that. So I would say that we have to recognize intersectionality, but our problem is that then we get caught in that intersectionality, having recognized it. So we have to, I wish I had the answers. I'm sure all of you out there will have better answers than I do. But I think our motive must be to transcend those.
Thanks, Jayati. Yeah, someone who does a lot of communication work within the NGO bubble, that's definitely something we can see in our communications and in our media, what a good job they do of pitting us against each other. Men against women, black against white, and we're so focused fighting against each other that, as Jayati said, we forget about the alliances and how ultimately all of the root of oppression is always the same: capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. So thank you very much for that, Jayati. Moving on to Carola, with your experience as an activist and politician, how do you navigate the intersection of feminist, decolonial, and eco-feminist perspectives to advocate for systemic change? And what strategies do you think are essential for integrating these movements into EU policymaking?
Yeah, thank you. These are big questions. So I think, first of all, I would like to say that in my practical political work, it's very important for me to be connected with other people. And with the exchange with others in group debates, even sometimes they take a long time and we maybe feel we're getting nowhere. Only through group interactions, I think, can we actually find a good point of opinion to look at the different sides of any issue in a practical sense. And now I think in this political world, we often focus on the person who holds officially this kind of member of the parliament badge. But let's be honest, for example, in my team, there are 6 people apart from me. So we are 7. And they come with different perspectives, and we need to have political discussions within the team with people born in different countries, with different experiences, and we constantly have discussions about what is most important and who we are responsible to and how we can change. And I think for us it is very clear, and even though there are different views on it, that obviously we have chosen to go to the parliament as an institution, even though we're very critical of what this institution is, how flawed it is, what it represents, what it has done historically. But we still think that it is important to be there, because I think we have to fight from within and from outside. And the people who are outside these institutions, they need allies. And I think that is how we see ourselves. We mostly see ourselves in the team as a sort of we're trying to offer an additional service, let's say, to people who are actually in the streets, who are active in struggles. So we see that, for example, recently we have been connected to people in Serbia who are fighting a big lithium mine. And it's, yes. Yes.
Friends from Serbia?
Yes. And I have visited.
Awareness about the other value.
Yeah, so thank you that somebody even saw these videos. So I went there, I visited actually some collectives of activists, and we can say that we have very limited, let's be honest, limited tools in the parliament. We can invite people to come here, we can share our platform, we can give a bit of media attention, we can ask parliamentary questions. In itself, these are not big things. They won't change much. But sometimes for the movements in another place, they mean a lot. Specifically when we help to receive visitors. We can, for example, for a delegation coming from Uganda ahead of the COP, we can easily write visa invitation letters. You know, we can help to pay for travel. I mean, these for us are maybe small things, but for other people can be small stepping stones. And yes, we always say, of course, the climate crisis is so urgent, everything, all the oppressions are urgent. But when we see everything has been going on for centuries, then maybe these tiny things that we do in the parliament are a small contribution. I would never go outside and say, like, what we're doing in the parliament is the most important and whatever thing. No, it's not. But it is a small contribution that we can use certain tools from the parliament for active struggles for people in the streets. But the real change is always going to come from the streets. It's always going to be from the streets and not from the people sitting in this, well, place.
Thank you, Carola. Absolutely, to workers' rights. Thank you. Jean, you're next. Why do countries remain trapped in a cycle of debt? From your experience at Eurodad, what specific mechanisms or strategies could be employed to resist these debt traps? And how should governments actively work towards not just debt cancellation, but economic sovereignty for these countries?
Thanks a lot. And just to say, I think that people like you, not the whole parliament, Carola, but people like you are what we need to be able to point to a kind of counter-narrative that is coming out of Europe and what is used by us in our advocacy work. So that is absolutely necessary for the people outside to have that kind of counter-narrative to point to. Vicious cycle, yes. I mean, I've already pointed to that in my previous answers. I mean, you have this wrong, absolutely wrong, imperialist, GDP-focused, colonial narrative, which leads to bad policy advice, which does not lead to healthy economies and healthy people. Quite the contrary, which leads to economies that need access to finance to continue to stay afloat. Most of that finance, particularly for the global south, is very, very expensive finance, which then leads again to more debt. And in an kind of current architecture, current world, where it is the IMF that is the judge and jury on debt, again, that leads to that cycle. So there's definitely that vicious cycle, and this points to why. What can governments do about it? There is this interesting initiative that has been kind of championed by Mia Mottley from Jamaica, the Bridgetown Initiative. You might have heard of this. And this is she calls out, first of all, the fact that international financial architecture is still very, very colonial, needs reform, or very, very good, calls for things like changing the way that contracts are designed, sovereign debt contracts are designed. For instance, calling for pause clauses when there is a kind of an emergency that a country faces, whether it is climate or a pandemic, then the countries should have the right, should be able to stop paying. And I think that's becoming much more conventionally accepted. The World Bank has accepted it. The G20 actually had that initiative during the pandemic when the debt crisis erupted. It had what it was called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. But the problem is all these proposals, as good as they are being championed from the leader or woman from the Global South, they do not provide the actual structural reform that is needed. And there are other things that can be done. One thing which has been basically pretty much taboo in international financial institutions is capital controls. Because basically, when the IMF goes to a country, it says, liberalize your economy, deregulate, let foreign investment come in through the floodgates. And what essentially is going to work out in the long run is if a country is able to regulate and decide, and a lot of countries in the global north have done that for many, many years, decide how, to what extent, capital can enter and leave the country. Policy space. But that has been essentially taboo. And countries should and can insist on this, but this is still very much part of the kind of the conservative economic view of what is good for an economy, and that needs to change. Another thing that needs to change is what I referred to in the start, kind of what makes an economy healthy enough to be able to afford to borrow and to be able to carry its debt and repay its debt. That needs to change. Debt sustainability analysis. It should turn into basically what makes a healthy economy, as Jayati said. And then the question of what is a good economy and how can it basically afford its debt, that comes next. If the logic turns on its head, and again, kind of a feminist-centered debt sustainability analysis would considerably change the whole ratio of what is important. Another very, very controversial, I realize, discussion, particularly with countries who are in debt distress, is for debtor countries who are facing the risk of not being able to repay their debt, or basically already defaulted, is to unite and say, we would rather default and face all the consequences, Argentina, rather than go through this painful and really, really slow process that we have been seeing these past few years that countries have to go through in debt restructuring, where you have kind of geopolitical interests over there, China, the US. You have private creditors holding out and refuse to sit at the table. Essentially, if debtor countries were to say en masse, we are going to default, what would be the next step? We'd have to rethink the whole conversation. It would have to be about how do we ensure that this debt restructuring negotiation is changed? If basically borrowers are able to, and I mean, over here, strength is in numbers, but it is a controversial issue because obviously when you are a country and you are faced with complete blockage from any source of finance, the financial markets, when the credit agencies are kind of ranking you as junk status, it is incredibly difficult to do that. So I recognize that this is a very, very controversial issue, but it is kind of close to the very, very radical solutions that can be taken. Another thing, and this is already on the agenda, has been discussed, is responsible lending and borrowing. There are principles that UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Department on Trade and Development. It used to be United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Now it's United Nations Trade and Development. They have these responsible lending and borrowing principles, and even though they are not explicitly feminist, you could essentially see how it could kind of align with a feminist economic agenda, because it essentially says it has to be putting the interests, the human rights obligations of a country at the center of responsible lending and borrowing. And lenders have to be mindful of these obligations of their own, as well as of the borrower countries. And then finally, credit agencies. This huge villain. It was a huge villain in 2008 when Europe was in the midst of this financial crisis. You have these big three, as they're called, who essentially have this stronghold around how a country is rated for its financial health. And this needs to change. There has to be much more regulation. There has to be much more plurality. Essentially, there has to be democratic control over credit rating agencies, which is not the case. And essentially, that discussion has fallen off the agenda after the financial crisis got over, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, Jean. Okay, a question to the panel. So we've been talking about the current economic approaches and policies and the economic policies and processes that actually should look at well-being and what is actually going to benefit all of us. So what practical steps can feminist movements and policymakers take to embed a more life-centered economic approach into global policy? And you've all already shared several ideas and examples, but perhaps there's something additional to add here. Would you like to start again, Jayati?
Thank you so much, Gail. And I will have to leave after this. My apologies, but it's been great being with you all, and thank you for the patience. No, I just have something very short and simple to say, which is much, much more emphasis on investment in care. Every society underinvests, some much, much more, but I think that's absolutely critical, and we should emphasize that it is obviously critical from the point of view of well-being, a healthy economy, etc., and less gender inequality, but it's also critical for employment generation, and maybe that is something policymakers will listen to. But my one top priority would be dramatically increased public investment in good quality care.
Thank you, Jayati. Very much to the point. Jean or Carola?
I'm sorry, but bye everyone.
Bye, Jayati. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And then there were two. All right.
Do you want to go first, Carola?
I can go first. I mean, there are a lot of things that could be mentioned, but I'll just go to one point or possibly two, because they're quite recent today, and I think they could be very interesting to you. I think you all have heard about carbon offsetting, and you all know probably that it doesn't work at all. And now, unfortunately, the European Commission under von der Leyen is trying to create a biodiversity offsetting market. This is terrible news. There are countries who have already engaged in sort of biodiversity trading schemes. For example, Australia has done so. The UK has started a program about 2 years ago. And Ursula von der Leyen is now slowly making her moves to put in the regulations to also have a market on biodiversity offsetting called biodiversity credits or something like that. Today there was a big manifesto published by a group called Biodiversity Market Watch. 230 civil society organizations have changed. I think there is, for us in the European Union, still some time to try to prevent that. I really think we must not be fooled again. I mean, some people, of course, have known from the beginning that carbon offsetting doesn't work. Others maybe understood later. But this cannot happen. We can't have any sort of nature markets. So it's very important, I think, for us to inform ourselves about this, to oppose it both at the European Union level, but also, I think, within civil society. This is not yet very much known, and I hope there's going to be more events, more engagement, more conversations about that, with the aim of stopping this before we have more finance market trading and commodifying of nature, which will not help a little bit to prevent destruction. So that is one important and recent point that I would like to mention. And maybe another small one connected to it, not so much maybe on the economy, but since I'm an ecologist, an important point which is connected to biodiversity is the land rights of indigenous communities. And I think there we have a lot of work to do as ecologists as well when we're talking about so-called protected areas and national parks. There have still been cases where in the last years, indigenous people and local communities, mostly known cases in Tanzania where there's Maasai people who have been forcibly expelled from their land to create hunting reserves, actually for the Emirati royal family, for example, but also just for tourism, mostly of white and rich people, let's say, to come there and see Africa devoid of people, for example, the Serengeti, and not recognize that it's actually indigenous communities who protect a lot of the biodiversity which we have on this planet remaining. And I think this is also something important that we have to have in mind. Land rights for people, or the recognition of the land rights within national or international systems, is incredibly important for the livelihoods of people. And I think it just comes to my mind because in the case of Tanzania, the Maasai women have been incredibly strong advocates for their land rights. And I think we can learn a lot from them. It's a very inspiring struggle, but it's not over, and we really have to pay attention to it and be an ally to it.
Thank you so much for raising these points, Carola. Jean?
No, I think, first of all, be vigilant. What you pointed out is a huge risk, a huge scandal after, as you say, the carbon offsetting problematic approach. Now they're doing biodiversity, and they are exporting carbon offsetting to Africa, where there is now a huge pushback from civil society over there. But it's kind of very connected to both the points that you're making, because essentially they want carbon sinks in Africa, but what about the people who basically are the ones who have ensured that Africa is able to be one of the lungs of the world, has been able to be one of the more responsible stewards of the planet. That is not at all considered, and that is a huge problem that needs to be countered. Be vigilant. Another kind of point that was linked to what Jayati said, and what we are really fighting against here in Europe, is the whole discussion on the Green Deal, European industrial policy, and the impact on the global South. What do they want to do? They want to export their energy dependency, creating solar farms in countries where land and access to energy, affordable, renewable energy, is already a problem. And through land grabbing and through essentially creating economically sound agreements with those countries, basically without considering what exactly those countries need to be able to have healthy economies, healthy environments, and healthy people. That is not part of the picture. green hydrogen is another one of those discussions. Countries like Namibia, where already water scarcity is a huge issue, and talking about green hydrogen and it being a win-win. So we need to be alert, and we need to look at it from a feminist perspective, because it's not just economic growth that is interesting for those countries. It's much more than that. Another thing I think is really important to know, as Jayati said, is it's indeed how they capitalize on making these intersectional inequalities the points of collision at the local national level, while essentially they capitalize on it at the international level. You see this whole in the kind of what is good business, and what does it mean to be doing good business. It's about putting a labor in conflict with each other. We've seen the World Bank doing that, and essentially preaching deregulation in countries which are still client countries, and that impacting labor movements in other countries where you still have a strong regulatory environment. So this is just some of the things that we have to be conscious of. Something kind of more linked to where I'm working on is, as I mentioned, the alternatives, a more feminist-based debt sustainability analysis. The examples that there are rife. For instance, instead of saying that you have to ensure that your GDP goes up through deregulation to allow foreign direct investment, some feminist economists have said, why not consider a metric by which you look at how much of money is given to health and education in a given year. When it falls below a certain level, a certain threshold, what you have to do is basically increase, for instance, the wealth tax, a tax on wealth or on capital, or on individuals and corporations that are contributing the most to climate change. Why don't we have those kind of discussions? Change the narrative, turn things on its head. A good opportunity that is coming up is the UN Financing for Development Conference that is happening in Spain, if there are any Spanish over here, Sevilla, in 2025, June, July. This is a place where you have a kind of a democratic space where all countries can talk about global norms on global economic norms, where civil society, where everybody can engage as a citizen. And I think there will be huge opportunities to push the boundaries and question this kind of orthodox economics in that space. So shout out if you're interested. Do follow what we are doing and do engage. We're really seeking to work together to show that there is a strong civil society voice, and that strong civil society voice has alternatives.
Okay, we managed more or less. Big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much, Jean and Carola. And thank you all for participating and engaging. So round of applause for you as well. Thank you.